So Russia's Vladimir Putin recently issued another round of nuclear threats, primarily though because America's Donald Trump has said the United States could start resuming nuclear testing. So to many, something feels different about it this time, primarily because this is a dangerous game of nuclear one-upmanship that feels like a flashback to the Cold War, but this time the international order, or as we say here, international disorder, is much more prevalent. It's what's known as an action-reaction cycle. But on the other hand, Putin's nuclear posturing has been a fixture of his full-scale war since day one. And while this moment might seem different as the line between intimidation and escalation, it starts to blur. We must understand that beneath the surface of the hyperbole of the rhetoric, it only exposes Putin's deepening desperation. So in this video, I'm going to review and explore what's really been going on behind Putin's latest set of nuclear rhetoric, why this particular cycle may feel more dangerous, and how Trump, intentionally or not, may well have just given the Kremlin the excuse it's looking for, all the while Ukraine continues to defend itself on its own.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we are returning to the Ukraine war, but specifically looking at the nuclear dimension. The nuclear doctrine that the Putin regime has utilized is very infamous, especially since the war in Ukraine took its full-scale nature. Since his speech, where he talked about denazification or defending Russian interests, Putin has often utilized and returned to the crutch, you could say, that is the threat of nuclear usage. Russia has the biggest amount of stockpiles in the world, and as he said in his infamous speech sitting from the Kremlin, he said that anyone who interfered would face, quote, consequences unlike anything in history. However, this rhetoric has always been limited because it's never actually been followed through on. He's adjusted policy, but never actually utilized it, luckily. But that being said, what do you think about this? I know many of you will think it's largely pointless to perhaps talk about it because it's just bluster, but I always think it's important to understand the mind behind the moves. Putin is a rational actor, despite what some people may say, him being irrational, a maniac. He is a rational decision maker because at the end of the day, he doesn't want to destroy the very country that he's seeking to, quote, protect or improve and to restore to its yesteryear of greatness. But more on that later on in the video. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments and consider liking it. It's free. But anyway, since the very beginning, Putin has made it very clear that nuclear weapons are a threshold that have red lines, and that if the West, with its support of Ukraine or the submission of certain things like ATACMS or HIMARS or these Tomahawk discussions, these are red lines that would push the Russians into a certain position. We seem to be 3 or 4 red lines over at this point, but, you know, Putin may well eventually follow through. Over the past few months, Putin has again ramped up the idea of hinting that lowering Russia's nuclear threshold, deploying the warheads to Belarus, and threatening to send nuclear weapons to Cuba or Venezuela. Very much Cold War deja vu. And a few days ago, ironically on Bonfire Night in the UK, November 5th, he went a step further, ordering preparations for the possibility of resuming nuclear testing. The Foreign Minister, Lavrov, who I did make a video wondering where he was, and he came out of the woodwork, perhaps my video prompted him to do so. There are directives being drawn up for nuclear tests, including in the Arctic. Lavrov has stated that the president's instructions has been accepted for implementation and the public would be informed of the results. Crucially, this move comes after President Donald Trump's surprise announcement that the United States would consider resuming testing. This is a dramatic reversal of long-standing arms control, and something that both sides, despite the conditions of the past 3 years, the past 10 years, have continued to follow, that they would engage in nuclear talks, the START treaties as they're known, especially over intermediate ballistic missiles, or IRBMs. Now, the Russian state media also reported that Moscow had received no clarification from Moscow about Trump's order, precisely the kind of concerns that we've always seen during the Cold War, the sort of red telephone, if you like. Simultaneously, Putin has been showcasing the new so-called superweapons, otherwise known as the Brevjesnik nuclear-powered cruise missile and the Poseidon, an underwater drone supposedly capable of creating radioactive tsunamis. Putin has boasted that there is no way to intercept either, but let's be honest here. These wonder weapons, which actually were first unveiled in 2018, well, there aren't really new tests. It's about the sort of theatre of the technology, the showcasing of them as we see when they do their constant May 5th or Victory Day parades of new technology. Each announcement is about the psychological war, meant to remind the world Russia is still dangerous. Don't push us over that red line, whichever one we seem to be on. Tongue-in-cheek jokes aside, why is this happening now? The timing of this nuclear chest thumping, you could say, does coincide with the new sanctions that has been hitting Russia's energy sector. The secondary sanctions, which are hitting China and India particularly, are a genuine problem for the Kremlin because it means Russia's alternative routes are being hit. And when 80% of your alternative consumers are China and India directly under the spotlight, that is a problem that even Russia is not going to be able to deny. Moscow's economy, as we've covered countless times on the channel, has been suffocating under the weight of these sanctions. Oil remains the region's lifeline, while you're seeing so many of these shadow fleets emerge around the Baltics or other parts of the Middle East. Every time the Kremlin feels concerned, then, whether it's after battlefield losses, sanctions, or diplomatic humiliation, it reaches for the same weapon: fear. That's why this latest wave of nuclear rhetoric isn't a show of dominance, it's a distraction, it's a desperation. Putin is trying to remind the world that Russia can still shake the table, even as its army bleeds manpower and its economy stagnates or largely declines at this point. I think it's very clear. When someone's back is up against the wall, they will lash out. This is what happened with the partial mobilization of September, October of 2022. And when most nuclear experts that I've spoken to really do think that Putin was on the precipice of considering utilizing a tactical nuclear warhead, at least. Perhaps not to directly strike a civilian center, but somewhere as the symbolic, say into the Sea of Azov, for example. But this is part of the paper tiger problem. Even Trump, who once seemed to admire Putin's strength, has started to call out this act. Back in September, if you remember, Trump described Russia as a paper tiger. The insult stung deeply in Moscow and some academics that I've spoken to, because beneath all the posturing, Russia's performance in Ukraine is nothing short of catastrophic. Yes, they are progressing on Prokrovsk, but at what rate? And to what extent will that change the overall dynamic and direction of the war? Nothing. Capturing one town of 60,000 people with a force double that is not going to alter the strategic implications of both sides. So when Putin parades this, quote, unstoppable set of nuclear toys, what he's really doing is overcompensating, perhaps in parts of himself as well. But he's trying to project the image of a powerful empire, when in reality, Russia's conventional forces are exhausted, its economy is hollowed out, and its population is shrinking faster than at any point since the 1990s. Other guests, when I've asked them, well, Russia's collapse, is it ever coming? Well, if you have a patient that has terminal cancer, you still have terminal cancer, and that is a very good analogy here. Or like a gangster who's lost control of his crew, Putin now relies almost entirely on intimidation, not credibility. And nuclear blackmail has become his version of waving a gun around in a bar full of fisticuffs. It's really reaching to new heights, which for Putin's lack of height is perhaps underwhelming. Last year, when Putin changed the nuclear doctrine, there was some awareness of it. When he made the announcements in September, October of 2022, there was a lot of rhetoric and media hysteria around it. This time, though, in preparing this script and this video, not as much. A few analytical pieces, a few bits of conventional media coverage, but pretty short and pretty blunt. The problem within all of this, though, is that not all Western leaders follow suit. Europe, as always, remains rather divided and hesitant, and the fears of escalation are paralysing decision-making because, naturally, Europe would be the first and foremost continent, place to be hit by any nuclear fallout. And each time Putin takes note of Europe's, inaction. That's the paradox. The more the West does fear the escalation, the more likely Putin is to exploit that fear. So the solution isn't to ignore the nuclear risk, it's to restore the deterrence. That means rebuilding credible conventional forces, tightening sanctions even further on Russia's war economy, and finally giving Ukraine longer-range weapons, or learning from Ukraine, as in Eastern European nations are beginning to do increasingly, about their experiences, since they are the ones who have been doing this for the past 3.5 years, or 10 years, and know better than anyone else how to take on the Russian war machine. So in the bigger picture, this escalating tit for tat between Moscow and Washington represents textbook action-reaction cycle. Each side moves, provoking the other to respond, slowly dismantling decades of arms controls and edging both toward new nuclear arms race. And that's without consideration other emerging or major players like China, who has been proliferating its nuclear capacities by 100 warheads a year in some estimations. It's still a good third of what Russia and America have in active nuclear warheads, about 1,500 each. But the point is that this causes the shift in policymaking across many different players, including potentially India, Pakistan, which with the escalations in that part of the region in May are very, very concerning as well. It's a slippery slope, the snowball effect, which compounds, but in a negative sense. With all that in mind, what happens next? Well, we can expect the new nuclear theatrics or tests to become more and more part of the rhetoric, which is more concerning because it normalizes it. It desensitizes us to the most singular, dangerous aspect of modern conflict and tensions of international relations. They are symptoms of a regime, in Russia at least, that is running out of real leverage. Its long-term weaknesses, demographic, economic, and militarily, are becoming harder to disguise. And the more desperate Putin becomes, the louder his threats will sound. And his growing reliance on even countries like North Korea, China, or Iran, countries that are much more reckless than necessarily others are in what their willingness to test or utilize nukes. Once that illusion fades, what does it mean for the normalization of the world that we live in? This moment marks a classic example of nuclear gesture being triggered by the mirroring of another. How nuclear arms races begin and why particular escalation in this case feels so much worse is because of the new circumstances we're in and Trump's seeming bullishness in his actions over Venezuela or other countries. Putin's nuclear threats are not the mark of a confident superpower, mind you. They're the tantrums of a leader whose grip on power and on reality, as he ages as well, are slipping. Ultimately, this is a conundrum. On the one hand, you have a desperate, running out of options as his economy flatlines, as his military operation is increasingly untenable, and generally the situation is less and less favourable. So we don't have to take his nuclear rhetoric too seriously. But on the other hand, the broader picture by which this is operating within, the leader of the most powerful country in the world, and other countries that are onlooking of the broader dynamics between Russia and the United States, or anyone in between, are taking notes. And so it means that the normalization of nuclear weapons as a means to deter or to force to get what you want is very concerning. I don't take too much notice of Putin's nuclear rhetoric, but because of the current circumstances that we live within, it's important to keep that in mind, and why I thought that this video was worth doing. We can't just look at the Russo-Ukraine war in a vacuum. We have to consider how it spills over into other parts, which is why I continue to cover things like the Sudanese war, like touching upon the relationship of Iran to its counterparts in the Middle East. All these things are intertwined, and if we don't understand international relations and geopolitics comprehensively, then we don't fully appreciate what nuclear rhetoric from Putin or even Trump really means. But with that said, let me know in the comments what you have to say. My name is Pyotr and I'm a mix of English and Russian. I've studied in the West, I've lived in all parts of the world, and I try to bring those varied opinions and views to the channel, be them through my own analysis or the guests that I interview. And if you enjoyed this and you want to support me further, links in the description to buy me a coffee or a beer and longer time memberships if you're so interested. We'll see you all in the next one. Take care, everyone.